Okay, so I have this photo here, and as you can see, it's a little bit underexposed. I typically like to shoot underexposed photos just because then I can play with the highlights a little bit more, and I'm 100% sure they're not going to be blown out if I shoot the photo underexposed. So for this particular image, I'm actually just going to go over and I'm going to crop it first. So I'm just going to hit C on my keyboard to grab my crop tool, and I'm going to use this nice crop preset ratio, and I'm going to use a 16:9. And I'm just going to pull this in, like that. Then I'll just drag this up, kind of right in the middle there. Just so we have these people playing over here with their dog, we have these people exiting the scene, and then we have this guy here. So we kind of have a nice little scene for our shot. I'll just hit enter on my keyboard. And there we go. Now we have a cropped photo. So all I really do whenever I'm starting out to edit a shot and I'm inside my develop tab is, as far as setting the tone and color goes, I like to take a look at my shot and I really kind of examine my shadows and my highlights. If my photo has too many kind of harsh highlighted areas where there's a lot of white on my shot, I typically don't go over and I pull up on the exposure, because whenever you have a lot of harsh highlights on your photo, if you pull up on the exposure slider, it's just going to make them harsher. Well, by looking at this photo, there's not a whole lot of white in my shot, so pulling up in the exposure probably wouldn't be a bad idea. So now I can just go over and I'm going to pull up in the exposure to kind of brighten this image a little bit. Probably just about right there. Because you'll notice that if I pull this up even further, I'm going to risk blowing out this entire sky behind my water tower here. So I typically just like to pull it up a little bit, maybe a little bit more than half a stop. So now what I want to do is I want to pull out the areas that are a bit darker. Whenever I underexpose a photo, I'm going to have darker shadows and midtones. So now that I've pulled up on my exposure slider, I'm just going to head down to my midtones and I'll just pull up on those and watch how that kind of alleviates some of that dark area from the grays in my photo. It's really pulled out the detail over here with this person and in these trees. And now because the photo's getting a lot better exposure and it's looking a lot brighter, all we have to do now to kind of set that foundational look is we're just going to pull up on the shadows just a hair. And you'll see I don't have to do a ton to it, but by even just pulling up on it about 21, we could even make it a little less, about 18, you'll see that it really pulls up those dark areas in this photo. You'll see in the trees over here, we couldn't really see those before, but now it's really giving us a lot of that detail back. So that's all I really do as far as setting the foundational look, is I typically look at my shot and I kind of examine the highlighted areas, the shadows, and then I pull up on the sliders to kind of match that tone. So for this particular photo, the last thing I want to do is I'm just going to warm it up because it is incredibly cool. So I'll just go down to my temperature slider and I'll just pull up on the temperature. Maybe a little more. Boom. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, just basic foundational look, no frills, just exposure, midtone, shadows, and color. So just kind of an easy way to set your base foundational look. Keep in mind that everything is non-destructive and re-editable, so you can always go in from here, add a local adjustment, play with that, go back to develop, play with that. So you can always go back and readjust. You're never stuck to one look. Okay, so now we want to apply detail. Obviously this photo has a lot of awesome little areas in it that need detail. These trees would look great with detail, this building would look great with detail, and because I shot it underexposed and I pulled up on the shadows, it's going to be a little bit soft and there might be a little bit of noise. So we might need to sharpen it up to bring back some of those details. So the first way that you can apply detail inside Photo Raw, and the most basic way to do it, is inside your tone and color pane here, inside your develop tab, just head down to your structure slider here. And structure is just going to bring in micro contrast and detail to your photo. So if I pull up on it, you'll see that's bringing in a lot of nice micro contrast and detail to the shot. But the one drawback, well, there's a couple drawbacks from applying detail with your structure slider. And my first drawback that I don't like is that it really kind of darkens up the image. What it does in here is it's adding contrast, and whenever you apply contrast to something, you're applying bits of black because there needs to be contrast between white and black. So you're getting a lot of dark areas in those micro areas of detail. So if I pull up on this, you'll see it's just bringing in a lot of dark. Well, that's because I'm not being able to modify anything with the structure. I'm only pulling up on the slider, and it's applying the detail that the algorithm is set to, and I can't go in and modify the small amounts of detail or the large or the medium. So for this structure slider, I would recommend using the structure slider if you're looking to apply detail to your entire photo without regard for how it looks or whatever it may be. So if you want to just apply structure just quickly to a photo, just go in and apply a little bit of structure with the structure slider. With that being said, I typically like to apply detail with either a local adjustment or dynamic contrast, just because I have the ability to go in and mask and brush it out. And with dynamic contrast, I can go in and modify the tone of that detail, I can bring out shadows, I can modify the vibrance, and I can also go in and modify the small, medium, and large areas. So for this particular photo, I'm going to go in and I'm going to go into effects here. We're going to add a filter, and we're going to apply detail with dynamic contrast. And you'll see, even just by applying that dynamic contrast and turning it off and on, it's applied a lot of nice detail to this photo, and you'll see that it's not as dark as it was when we were pulling up on that structure slider. Well, that's because we can modify the different areas of contrast that we apply. So let's zoom in here real quick to these trees and kind of this building. So inside your dynamic contrast filter, you have 3 areas that you can modify. You have your small areas of contrast, your medium, and your large. Well, I actually created a nice little preset that zeroes them out just so I can kind of show you guys how they work. So the small areas of contrast are going to be, your small little areas of detail like trees, grass, really fine textures. So watch as I pull up on this small slider. See how it brings out a lot of that detail in this in the trees in this, or the branches in this tree, and also the grainy kind of textured area on this building. But if I pull up on the medium slider, see how it's bringing a lot more detail into the mid-tone areas on this building, kind of where there's a lot more medium-sized contrast. And if I pull up on this large slider here, oops, let's go down to 0. If I pull up on this large slider here, you'll see that the building is kind of the thing that gets most of that contrast. That's because it's pulling out all of the large micro contrast and detail and applying that dynamic contrast filter to it. Well, the great thing about this filter is that we can modify all 3 at the same time to kind of cater our needs. And we can also mask and brush it on so we can apply it to specific areas on our photo. So for this particular photo, let's go in and let's brush some small detail into these trees and maybe bring out some of the vibrance and shadows. And then we can go in and brush a new dynamic contrast filter onto this water tower here that strictly pulls out the medium to large. So let's go here, and I typically like to go into these more preset styles. And my favorite one for pulling out small is this texture enhancer one. It increases your small to 60, it gives you a little bit of medium, and it doesn't modify any of the tone. Well, it's a little bit crunchy on my water tower, and obviously I have a person here, so I don't want them to be crunched up also. So let's go over to our dynamic contrast filter, and in our masking options right here, I'm just going to click invert. So now I've inverted that mask, and now it's not being revealed to my photo. Now I need to brush that on into the specific areas that I want it to show it. So now I have my masking brush selected. If you don't have your masking brush selected and you want to select it, remember that B on your keyboard grabs your masking brush. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my mode to paint in by holding down Shift and hitting X on my keyboard. And I'm just going to kind of, not really with too much regard for painting inside the lines, I'm just going to kind of paint these on, or paint this on the trees here. Kind of avoid her. Maybe pull that right there. Perfect. Oh, maybe you could put it over here in these shrubs there. Okay, cool. And now in my dynamic contrast filter, a lot of people don't really know, or they don't play with it, but down here you can modify the tone of this filter. So not only can you modify the detail, but you can also go in and let's say I want to bring out some of the shadow details from the area that I painted in. I can just pull up on the shadows and watch how it reveals those trees. So we'll pull up on those just a little bit. And I'm also going to pull up on the highlights a little bit. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to bring in a little bit more contrast. And also, there may have been a lot more highlights in this photo, but since I shot it underexposed, I might have lost them in that underexposed shot. So we'll just pull up on the highlights. And then the whites a little bit. And then I'll just pull up on the vibrance to bring in a little bit more green. Boom. So now if we turn this dynamic contrast filter off and on, it does a good job of pulling out all of that detail in these trees here. And we can always go into our opacity slider and we can pull it back to make it look more natural. Cool. So now we need to modify our water tower here. So I'm just going to add another filter. I'll add dynamic contrast. And I'm actually going to pull up on this medium quite a bit and this large quite a bit. So now we'll do the same thing. We'll go in and we'll invert this mask. And then we'll just brush it on to this water tower. And we can pull back on it a little bit just to make it a little bit more natural. Cool. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, just by modifying a few sliders and then going in and adding that dynamic contrast filter, we've selectively applied detail and we made sure that the people in our photo weren't all crunched up. So that's one way to apply dynamic contrast to a photo rather than applying structure. So we'll just carry on here and we'll just go to another photo and I'll show you how I would bring out that tonality and then apply detail. So let's head on to a flower. So this is one of those times, like I was saying earlier, when I really, kind of have to look at the photo and examine what slider I need to use. Well, if I'm taking a look at this shot, I'm seeing that there's quite a bit of light hitting the flowers here. And that could pose a problem for me if I'm pulling up on the exposure slider. It could blow out these areas and these leaves here, so I have to be careful whenever I'm trying to brighten an image that has a lot of these kind of highlighted areas in here. If you have a lot of harsh shadows and harsh highlights in your photo, I would stay away from pulling up on the exposure slider too much. You can always modify it, or modify the brightness from your photo with a ton of other different filters and sliders. So for this particular photo, I'm actually going to go down to my temperature slider first. And I shot it when it was really cool. All right, I think I shot it when it at a fluorescent light setting, yeah. So I'm just gonna go and I'm gonna click cloudy. And that pretty much fixed that color. So now, as far as the foundational look for this shot goes, the first thing I'm gonna pull up on is my midtones. Because my midtones are gonna be these kind of middle toned areas, kind of your grays in your photo. And there's a lot of those in this shot. So watch as I pull up on my midtones here. Boom. It's pulled out all of those nice little midtones areas in my photo. And watch if I pull up on the exposure slider. See how that's bringing in so much harsh light into those petals on the flower? So just be careful if you have, a lot of stark contrast between your highlights and shadows. You can kind of blow them out heavy with that exposure slider. So I'll just pull up on the midtones again, bringing out those nice midtones in the photo. And I'm actually going to remove some of this contrast. And the reason I'm removing contrast is because I just want to kind of alleviate some of this darker color in my background. And don't worry, I can always add in contrast later. But you'll notice that by pulling back on that contrast slider, I really kind of took this harsh dark lit background away from my flowers and made it a lot more appealing. So the last thing I want to do is I'm actually going to go down and I'm going to pull up on my shadows just a little bit. Just like that. And now we're going to go down to our blacks and we're going to add in just a little bit of true black to bring back some of that contrast. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, You'll see I've kind of protected these highlighted areas on my petals by not playing too much with that exposure slider and rather pulling up on the midtones and then removing some of that contrast. Okay, so actually let's just crop this real quick. And then I like to use a 4x5. Oops. Just use a 4x5. Perfect. Okay, so now we need to apply detail to this photo. Well, if I pull up on this structure slider here, I mean, it's applying a nice amount of detail, but again, it's also being applied to the entire photo, and it's also adding in a little bit of black, which in turn is bringing in a little bit of purple to these petals. So you'll notice that if I pull up and down on this, you'll see how much of that kind of purpley color goes into the flower petals. Well, a good way to fix that is I could actually play with that vibrant slider with my dynamic contrast filter, and then I could modify it so that none of that purple goes into it. Or I could add a local adjustment layer and I could modify the temperature, and then I could apply detail with that. So let's apply detail with two ways with these flowers here. And the first way is we're going to do it with dynamic contrast. So I'll go into effects here, I'll add a filter, and I'll just add dynamic contrast. Boom. And if I turn this off and on, that does an awesome job at applying that detail in here, especially the small areas, without kind of darkening it up and adding that purple color cast or that blue color cast. So now let's go in, and one thing I like to do if I'm applying detail to areas, especially with flowers, is I don't like to crunch up the things that are out of focus. So if I zoom in here to these out of focus flower petals and I turn this off and on, it's really kind of crunching them up because there is still small amounts of detail in the out of focus areas. Well, we only really want this selectively applied to these kind of 3 in focus flowers right here. So we're going to go to our dynamic contrast filter. We're going to invert it so that it's not applied to our shot. And then again, we're going to use our masking brush, and to switch from paint out to paint in, just hold down Shift, hit X on your keyboard, and now I can just brush this on these flowers right in front. Boom. And now I can go in, and for this particular photo, especially flowers, I'd recommend pulling up on your small. And then I'm going to remove a little bit of that large. And now I'm going to go in, and I'm actually going to pull up on these highlights to bring back a little of those highlights and those flowers right there. Boom. So now if I turn this off and on, because I brought back some of those highlights with that detail, it's really kind of separated this flower from these other flowers in the background, which wouldn't have happened if I applied this entire dynamic contrast filter to the photo. So watch if I reset this. See how those are kind of brought back in when you don't really want them strong in the photo? They're out of focus for a reason. So I would recommend not applying detail, or at least a lot of detail, to out of focus areas in your photo, especially if you're shooting flowers or something delicate. So we'll just undo that, and voila. That's how I would probably recommend doing it as far as flowers go. So now let's exit out of this dynamic contrast filter, and I'll show you how I would do it with a local adjustment. So let's go into our local adjustment tab, and local adjustments are great for applying detail also, except for when you apply local adjustment detail, you're applying structure. So again, you're not going to have the ability to go back and modify your small, medium, and large. It's just kind of applying that detail, and you get what you get. But it's still an awesome way to apply detail, and then you can modify your tone and color a lot more. So kind of a little trade-off. So exposure, I'm just going to reset to 0. And I'm going to pull up on my structure slider here. And I'm going to go down, and I'm going to use my temperature slider, and I'm going to warm it up just a little bit. That way I can remove some of that kind of color cast on these flowers. So I'll just go in, and I'll just brush this on. Let's actually add a little bit more contrast. Well, there we go. There we go. Probably about there. Perfect. So now if we turn this local adjustment layer off and on, again, does an awesome job of bringing out that detail in these flowers. And it also gave me the ability to kind of cool that area down that was a little bit too blue. And then we can go in and I'll just add a little bit of dehazing, which is kind of your highlight fixer. And boom. Awesome. Okay, so let's move on to the next photo. And let's do this one because this is a good one. Before I move on with this photo, are there any questions about anything that I'm showing so far? I know it's kind of basic about applying detail, but applying detail really isn't that advanced. So if you do have any questions though, let me know and I'll answer them throughout. Okay, so for this shot, the first thing I want to do is I want to crop it. I definitely want to remove this area from the outer edge of my photo and just kind of focus solely on this leaf. So we'll just hit C on our keyboard. I'm just going to use a 1x1. See if that fits in here. No, all right, we're going to have to use a 4x5. Boom. Hit enter on our keyboard. And there we go. And so for this photo, again, we want to analyze it to look at the highlights and the shadows. Well, there's not too many harsh highlights on this photo, but there are little areas in here where you could get kind of some blown out areas if you do pull up on the exposure too much. So let's try the exposure slider first to see what it looks like. Not too bad. Now let's pull up on the shadow slider and see what that looks like. I would say the shadow slider is a little bit better. So let's go on here and we'll pull up on our shadows. And now the photo is going to be a little bit flat. And the reason it's flat is because we're pulling up on all of the shadow tones and we're not adding in any contrast or anything to kind of separate those tonalities. So let's go in and we'll bring in a little bit of contrast. I'll pull up on my midtones. And now we need a little bit of highlight. So we'll go down to our whites and we'll boost those as well. And then I'm just going to head down to my temperature and I'm going to warm it up. About right there. And this particular photo is kind of one of those gray areas when applying detail can be, should I apply detail with my structure slider or should I apply detail selectively? And for me, I typically like to, like I said, apply detail with either a local adjustment or dynamic contrast. But since this photo is basically an entire photo of detail and texture, you could probably go down and get away with just pulling up on your structure slider here. Because you'll see that by pulling up on that, it really does a good job of bringing in some of those darker kind of contrasty areas around this leaf. And because it's adding in a little bit of darkness, it's pulling in some of that contrast that we lost when we pulled up on those shadows. So applying detail is kind of an experimental game, whether you want to, bring back some of that dark into your photo, or you want to, apply it with dynamic contrast and kind of keep it away. So that's with the structure slider, and that's actually not that bad as compared to the other ones. But let's actually apply it with dynamic contrast so we can really get in here and we can modify all that small detail in there. Okay, so we'll go into effects here, we'll add a filter, and we'll add dynamic contrast. And for this particular photo, I would recommend just using a preset style here. And like I was saying, one of my favorite ones is this texture enhancer. So if I turn this on, turn this off and on, you'll see it really pulls out all of that small little detail in here within this leaf. But it's kind of crunching up those areas that are blurred out and out of focus. And like I was saying, I wouldn't apply detail, or at least a lot of detail, to out of focus areas. So we're going to go in and we're just going to kind of brush this off. So we'll just, actually, we'll just brush this off. So we'll use our masking brush, and then we'll just brush this off of the areas that we don't want the detail. You can see how much noise it's making from that detail. Cool. So now if we turn this off and on, see how much better that looks when it's only applied to that leaf? If we reset this and turn this off and on, see how that just kind of crunches up the entire thing? And now one of my favorite things to do, especially if I have little water droplets like this, is I'll go over to my local adjustment tab. I'll go in here and actually add Magic Eye Fixer. And I'm going to turn the exposure down. And I'm going to pull up on this structure. And I'm going to pull up on the whites quite a bit. And the midtones just a hair. And then I usually go in, and for these little water droplets, I'll just drop this on. These little water droplets. And don't worry about being too, like I was saying, painting in the lines, because we're going to go over and we're going to pull back on the opacity anyway. And you'll see that by even just kind of brushing this on randomly into these little water areas, it'll add a ton of nice kind of exposure boosts where you have these water droplets. Couple more here. This one's probably perfect for that. And then get one more. And then that one. Okay, so now let's head over. And if we pull over on our opacity slider, and then we just pull up on it a little bit. And now if we turn this off and on, see how that helps add in a little bit of detail, brings out some of those highlights in the little balls. And it really brought out some of those water droplets in the thing. Sorry, I was interrupted by a coworker right there, and that's why I'm losing my train of thought. So blame Newt for that. Okay, so now that we've gone in there and kind of modified those little water droplets, now what I want to do is I just want to go in and I just want to bring in a little bit of exposure and detail to these other areas. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use a color range mask. So we're going to add a new local adjustment layer. I'm going to go down to my exposure, and I'm actually going to pull up on the midtones just a hair, just a tiny little bit. Shadows just a tiny little bit. And we'll add a little bit of dehaze. And then I'll just go in and I'll go into my color or my masking options for my local adjustment, and I'll use a color range mask. And I'm just going to take this color dropper and I'm going to drop it on this green. Now if I view this mask, it's being applied to that green area on my leaf. So I'll just play with this level slider here to kind of remove it from the majority of my photo. Boom. So now if I turn this off and on, it gives it a kind of nice little subtle boost to even bring out that detail even more. It almost makes it look like it was backlit, kind of through the leaf through the back. So that's just kind of a quick way if you're shooting flowers or something with large tonalities and also a lot of detail to kind of boost up the areas where you lost some of that. Awesome. So let's move on to the next photo. Are there any questions kind of while I'm cruising through here? Let's get down to these ones. Let's actually do this one. Okay, so for this particular photo, I know that I really don't want the majority of this frame. I only really want this kind of my imaginary square area where I'm kind of compose this tree right here with this building, and then I want these people. So for the foundational look, I'm gonna crop it real quick, and I'm just gonna pull in on my 4x5, and then I'll just pull, well, let's pull it a little bit more. Boom. And then I can level it real quick. Cool. So now we have kind of a crop photo with these people sitting here. And obviously this is a photo where we probably don't want to apply detail to the entire thing, especially if there's people in the photo. But first, let's set that foundational look. And like that photo we were looking at earlier with the flowers and the highlights on it, I'm probably not going to want to pull up too much on my exposure just because of these highlighted areas in my sky. So if I pull up on the exposure here, you'll see that those quickly kind of pull up and they get a little bit too white and bright for me. But if we pull up on this shadow slider here, I think probably I only need like a boost in my shadows from this shot. And then maybe a little bit of midtones. But you'll see that that's not pulling up on these, backlit areas in the sky and blowing them out. It's just pulling up strictly on the shadows and the midtones so you don't risk getting too much of a distraction with these blown out areas. Then we'll add just maybe a little bit of white in here. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so now if I pull up on my structure slider to apply detail, we're going to bring in a lot of dark, and we're also going to crunch up this area with these people and make it a little bit too harsh. Also, by pulling up on that structure slider, if I zoom in over here, look how much detail it's applying to this area that's out of focus and really kind of taking away the look of these people here. So if anything, we want to keep this area as soft as possible. So again, this is one of those photos where I probably wouldn't recommend applying structure or detail inside of tone and color. I would recommend using either a local adjustment layer or going in and applying dynamic contrast. So let's do both, and we'll start with dynamic contrast. So I'll reset my structure here, and we have sort of this base look. I could probably even warm it up a little bit. What do you guys think? That's probably good. Okay. So let's go into effects. We'll add a filter, and we'll add dynamic contrast. And even then, it does a good job of bringing in some of that detail, but I still don't like how it crunches up this area over here. So we'll actually just zoom into these people. And one thing I do like to do before I'm adding different modifications to the filters is I do like to zoom into the area that I'm actually applying the detail to, because it's going to give you a good idea of what that detail is doing to your subject. So for this particular shot, I don't want to bring in too much small detail. The reason I don't want to bring in too much small detail is if I pull up on my small, it's going to crunch up these people quite a bit. And even though we're pretty far away and you probably wouldn't be able to tell, I just feel like it wouldn't really look good, especially with this bench being here and these bikes. I'd rather have like a nice sort of soft, subtle dynamic contrast in here instead. So we'll pull back on that small, and I'll just pull up on the medium. See how that's not crunching up these people at all? And then I'll pull up on the large quite a bit. So let's zoom out now. And if I turn this off and on, awesome job of bringing in some of that detail, but it's a little bit too crunched up. So let's, large is at 97. Okay, that's probably why. So let's pull these down to about there. Boom, that looks about perfect. But it's still applying to that place up there. So what we need to do is we need to grab our masking bug and remove it from this top area. So if you need to grab your masking bug, just hit M on your keyboard. And now you can just drop it down. I usually just like to drop it down on a horizon line. And now if I turn this off and on, it's only being applied to this area in here. Well, since it's only being applied to this area in here, I can modify these shadows to bring out some of those shadow tones that I was looking for, and also some of those whites. And I can play with the vibrance to bring in more color. So you'll see just by using that dynamic contrast filter, we've actually brought a lot of tonality and detail into this area down here. And it looks a lot better than it would if it was applied to the entire photo. All right, so let's do one more here. And we'll do a portrait one. Because I know it's kind of an iffy thing applying detail to portraits. And the reason I'm choosing this one is because it's a little bit out of focus, except for these eyes. So I think this would work perfect to show you guys how to selectively apply detail to portraits. Oops, sorry, I went ahead of myself. I didn't even do a local adjustment layer. All right, let's go back and I'll show you guys how to do how I would use a local adjustment layer here. Sorry. Got ahead of myself. Got excited about the release and got ahead of myself. So, okay, so we'll go to our local tab. We have a new local adjustment layer added. I'm just gonna go down to exposure, and I'm gonna pull up on the kind of the same sliders we did with that dynamic contrast. I'll pull up on my shadows, my whites, midtones a little bit, maybe, and then we'll apply some structure. So now we'll use our adjustment gradient, which you can grab by holding down Shift and hitting K on your keyboard, or it lives up in this top bar in your local tools right next to your adjustment brush. So now I'll just drop this down, and now I can play with the opacity and the structure. And if I turn this off and on, again, does a good job of bringing out some of that nice detail, some of these nice tones, and it's not being applied to our entire photo. All right, so let's move on, and we'll do the portrait one. So for portraits, applying detail to portraits is kind of a should or not. It can really crunch up skin, and that's probably the reason why a lot of people don't like to apply detail to portraits. But in some cases, especially with a really soft portrait, you can kind of probably get away with it. The reason I'm applying detail to this portrait is if I zoom in on her eyes here, they're not as soft as the rest of the photo, which you can make really cool looks if you have a subject that's kind of in focus and the rest of it is a little bit blurry. And you can fix those areas by using dynamic contrast or local adjustments, or in this case, we might go in and we'll apply a little bit of sharpening. So for this particular shot, setting the foundational tone, I'm not really too concerned with. I'm only gonna go in and actually modify the crop, and I'll probably just warm the photo up a little bit. So I'm just gonna go and grab my crop tool, and I'll use this nice 4x5. Maybe I'll scoot it in just a little bit, like that. Perfect. So now we have kind of a crop shot here. And I'm actually really going to focus on the color and just on the composition like I was saying. So let's just go over to our Develop tab, and I'll warm this photo up. Boom. See how that looks a lot better? Okay. So now what I want to do is I kind of want to bring in a little bit of detail to her eyes in here. But then I want to maybe bring in a blur or something to remove a lot of the sort of unfocused area, or just kind of play with it a little bit. So for this particular photo, let's add dynamic contrast first. Because, well, if we applied structure first, you'll see that applying structure is not the best way to go when it comes to portraits. I would definitely look at applying detail selectively with portraits. So we'll add a filter. We'll add dynamic contrast, and I don't want this applied to the entire shot. So I'm just gonna go in and I'm gonna invert this mask. Now I'm gonna zoom in, and I'm just gonna brush this dynamic contrast onto her eyes, her eyebrows, and her lips. Now I'm going to head over, and I'm just going to pull up on the small a little bit to bring in a little bit of that small detail. And then I'll just go in and I'm going to pull up on the whites. There we go. So if I turn this off and on now, does a good job of bringing some of that detail into her eyes. You can also add a little bit more medium. There we go. Boom. So if let's zoom out here. And I turn this off and on. Pretty good job of bringing in some of that detail. Well, a cool thing with detail is if you apply enough detail to an area and you apply kind of a blur around it, you can make kind of a cool motion blur effect using a blur filter. So for this particular photo, I have these eyes where I've brushed in that dynamic contrast. So I'm just going to copy that dynamic contrast mask. I'm going to add another filter. I'm going to add blur. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to click radial. And I know this looks pretty crazy, but you can make kind of a cool look with soft portraits by using this technique. So in your blur filter, I'm going to head down to this centering icon, and now I can center it, and I'm just going to center it on her face. Just like that. Now what I want to do is I'm going to go into my blur, and I'm going to paste that mask. Now I'm going to invert the mask so that it's not being applied to her eyes in here. Well, what we need to do is we need to make this look a little bit more natural. Obviously, it looks like I just painted in her eyes and a blur filter. So let's go up to our top bar here, and with our perfect brush selected, I'll lower the opacity about 25. I'm going to set my brush to paint out. And now I'm just going to kind of lightly brush some of that blur off her face. But now we need to make it look a little bit more realistic. So make sure your brush is set to paint in, and it's about 20. And then just make kind of large brush strokes kind of around their face, even on a little bit, just to bring back some of that blur so it looks a little bit more natural. Perfect. So now if I head over to this blur filter and I pull on it, the opacity, I can kind of lower it to make it a little bit more natural. Maybe it right there. Let's actually add a little bit more. Boom. So by applying that detail and bringing in some of that kind of harsh detail into her eyes again, we've then played with the blur around it to kind of create this kind of long exposure motion blur shot. And then if I go in and I'll add a filter, and we'll just add LUTs, and we'll add a nice black and white here. Boom. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, really kind of stylized it and made a unique look just by using a dynamic contrast filter and a blur filter.